What's up, everyone? Here's Oscar right here. And so we are going to be going over 1950, no, 1960, 1970 right now. Um, and so last time I think I ended off with. So I think when we sent ensigns into Vietnam to train the South Vietnamese to fight the North Vietnamese. And so a lot of things were going on in the U.S., especially with the Red Scare. And so, of course, we talked about the Iron Curtain and everything, and which pretty much Russia isolated off eastern half of the of Europe from the western half. And so now we got this contention between Western NATO and then, of course, the with Russia and then its allies, especially with China, North Korea, places like that. And so now we got, because of the spies with the Manhattan Project, and then um, people thinking that there are spies within the U.S. now from Russia. Now there's this Red Scare, and so that's basically, we are hyper aware of what was it, not, what do you call that, of communist allies or communist sentiment people in the US. And so now you get this heightened, kind of like people wiretapping, people being questioned, interrogated, imprisoned, for possibly being communist. And so it's widespread, it's all worldwide. And then this guy by the name of Joseph McCarthy, he starts using that against, he starts using that for his campaign, essentially. And so this coins the term like McCarthyism, essentially. But basically, it's this idea that he uses this popular opinion amongst the people to then create this world of um, constant paranoia, essentially. And so he goes on this rampage where he starts off with just the basic public, and then he goes on to politicians, and then people in the workforce, places like that. And so as he's going along, you got this idea of now nuclear warfare. And so when Eisenhower became president, and he was kind of like, he was heavily religious. He believed in the fight against good and evil, essentially, but he also believed in Armageddon. And so, with that being said, he created this idea of MAD. And so with MAD, I'm gonna have this right here. Basically, it's mutually assured destruction. And so, with that being said, MAD. So now he's going to essentially, because he's religious, he also doesn't like the idea of going out, sending people's children out to die. And so this kind of nuclear warfare was something that he was kind of pushing towards, but also he wanted to make sure that if we go down, they go down with us. And so what he wanted to do was reduce ground troops. Ground troops. Then also he wanted to increase the nuclear production and use the idea of nuclear weapons as an act of diplomacy. And so increase. There we go. So that's, a bit too far. There we go. So there we go. That's where it is. So up, this way. MAD. There you go. MAD. That's weird. All right. So he wanted to use this essentially as, of course, as diplomacy, but also as a means of or like nuclear energy as like long-term energy supply as a means for like peaceful means. And um, he later called for the disarmament and peace as well. And so essentially he wanted to use this as a way to make sure that there's peace. There will be no more war because people now know the gravity of nuclear weapons. And so that was his idea of, that was his kind of like his administration's idea of using nuclear weapons in this new era in the 1950s. And um, so this is like the early 1950s. The Red Scare was heightened, and so then we got the Iron Curtain coming along. So Joseph McCarthy, as he's going along, he started questioning more and more people, and so his popularity started to decline. And over time, as people started to get kind of used to it, his popularity started to decline, but also the Red Scare became less prominent. And so by 1954, McCarthyism kind of dies essentially, and um, that was the year when he started to question the army. And now you can question the public, you can question all these like tradesmen, businessmen, politicians, sure, yeah. But once you question the U.S. Army, that's where you messed up. And so at the hearings, this man by the name of Joseph Welch, he coined the popular term, "Have you no sense of decency, sir?" That right there was when he died. And so right there, that's when Joseph McCarthy's decline in popularity started. And that was when this man by the name of Roy Cohn, who was also the chief counsel senator at the time, he then became a legal political fixer in New York City. And then he was hired by actually this rich man in New York City. This rich guy wanted to actually put his son through politics, and he knew that Roy Cohn was the guy to do it. And so, in order to do so, he wanted to have Roy Cohn train this young boy to then get into politics. And that young boy also was no other than Donald Trump, which is kind of a little fun fact right there. And so by the late 1950s, you got the Bay of Pigs. And so Fidel Castro was this rising, I don't want to say rebel, but communist sympathizer, essentially. And Che Guevara as well. And so they led an army to Havana to overthrow General Fulgencio. And so Fulgencio Batista was his name. And he also, who then at that time supported the U.S. So you got Fidel Castro, who supported the USSR, then also and communism and giving power to the people, and then you got Batista, who supported the U.S. and the Republic, essentially. And so, what was it? In order to prevent a future invasion, Khrushchev agreed to give mid-range ballistic missiles to Castro, who supported communism. Because in order to protect Cuba from Russian advance, the U.S. thought about actually taking control over Cuban goods, shipping, everything. And so to prevent that, Khrushchev wanted to do that, to send ballistic missiles into Cuba. So now you got this. So now you got the Cuban Missile Crisis, essentially. Man. Sitting outside because it's a great day out too. Yeah, Cuban Missile Crises. I'm gonna put this back here. There you go. So the Cuban Missile Crisis happens where it kicks off. And so the U.S. and the USSR are both at like a stopping point where this essentially is kind of like at the beginnings of this Cold War. And so they know that both of each other have nuclear missiles or nuclear rockets, and putting them in Cuba now puts nuclear warheads off the coast of the U.S. And so JFK at the time needed something to do. So then Well, sorry. So I'm going to back up here. So at the same time, so this is about a year before kind of things start ramping up a lot. And so in 1960 as well, because of the Sputnik mission, JFK is like, we need to put someone on the moon. And so JFK also started to campaign for the beginning of a new era, the new frontier. And so by doing so, he pretty much he kickstarted this the space race. He also wanted to focus on eliminating inequality and injustice in the U.S. The South had hatred for him, and but also they also hated the fact that he planned for Operation Mongoose, or the elimination of communist rule in Cuba, um, and as well, nuclear missiles under Nikita Khrushchev were allowed to be placed in Cuba to deter any further invasion, as well as and so on, and all that. And so, um, essentially, we had all these avenues where you got the Cuban Missile Crisis kicking off as well in the early 1960s. You also got the Red Scare kind of dying down as well, but also the Cold War officially is like kicking off at the same time as the Vietnam War. Um, and so, I'm gonna go back to my notes here. So 1950, 1960. Cool. All right. So, a year after JFK calls for that new frontier, you get the Berlin Wall. And so, 1961, the Berlin Wall goes up, and it basically encircles the the western half or the western bloc, cutting off all aid to the west essentially. And so, Soviet influence then becomes stronger in West Berlin because there is no aid coming to them anymore. 62, officially, JFK realizes that these missiles in Cuba are a problem. And so he doesn't. So at the time, he didn't really know from, I think, that whole year, he didn't know until he had surveillance going over Cuba and he noticed there was missile sites. And so I'm gonna try to post a link to the document that talks about those missiles. But essentially, he needed a way to gather public sentiment to de-escalate the issue. Well, possibly de-escalate the issue militarily. Now, we just got done with a Korean War. We just got done with a World War. At this time, and now we're sending enzymes over to Vietnam to help them with their war. At this time, people are pissed about another war. And so they're just tired. And so, then, apple crisp, or honey crisp, apple cider. Pretty sick stuff. And so, yeah, so they're pissed, and they're like, we don't want anything to do with this. So, the document comes back, and on the document, it says that these mid-range ballistic missile sites are not nuclear, in fact. And so, but he doesn't want to tell the public that. So now, the public thinks that there's nuclear warheads in Cuba. Now, JFK has three options laid out in front of him. One, he conducts an airstrike on the missile sites in Cuba, potentially kicking off a war between the USSR and gathering Cuba as an ally to the USSR. Now has the option to invade the US. Two, complete invasion of Cuba. You take over Cuba and eliminate that idea of a future invasion by them, but also you now start a war, or you now start a war with Cuba, but also they have an ally as with the USSR, who could then draw them into the war. Three, they conduct political talks with a threatened action. So, October 22nd of 62, JFK then decides on a naval blockade of the island. So he's not going to fire on them, but it's going to be a naval blockade or something. So, hey, how are you?
Good, how are you?
I'm pretty good. And so, yeah, that was my neighbor. So then, October 24th, a letter was sent to Khrushchev, and he basically explains his actions for why he did he explains his actions for why he did the blockade, the naval blockade, and he wants him to return the missiles to USSR. Khrushchev doesn't answer. So then, U.S. was sent into DEFCON 3, which was basically implemented a widespread Cuban quarantine. And then he set up for the eventual strike on Cuba. Now, Khrushchev then later on, because of hearing about this, he sent a letter to JFK saying that that was an act of aggression and they will be conducting military operations if he does not stop. So then, U.S. intelligence then stated that the missiles are being prepared for firing. U.S. then up to DEFCON 2, which then that consists of that war is under strategic command, war was imminent, and that strategic command was going to be taking place. Kennedy then believed that the only way to remove those was by force now. So then, the 26th happens. In that morning, there's a Soviet agent that comes along, and he goes over to the ABC News and delivers a message saying that Khrushchev is open to talking things out and de-escalating the issue. Do not fire. We're going to try to figure this out. So then, that same night, a letter was sent to JFK by Khrushchev explaining that there will be a thermonuclear holocaust and that he is ready to de-escalate if Kennedy is. So basically, Khrushchev is just like, if you don't de-escalate the issue, we're going to take over. So then, what was it? So then he's like, let us untie the knot. Do not invade Cuba, and we will remove missiles. Yada yada yada. 27th happens. Khrushchev wanted all U.S. nuclear missiles removed from Turkey in exchange for Kennedy to decide on a bold move. So Kennedy decides on a bold move. Sorry, he wants to he can either ignore the second message and address the first to not invade Cuba, or he can opt to explain why he can't move the missiles out of Turkey. So, Kennedy decides to go with the former option. He ignores the option to remove the missiles out of Turkey, but then he talks about not invading Cuba. Robert Kennedy, who's in on it too, he meets with the Soviet ambassador and promises the removal of Jupiter missiles from Turkey, but they don't do that. So then 2 days later, a day later actually. So a day later, Soviet missiles are then removed from Cuba, and all of the IL-28 bombers, so Soviet bombers, I believe those are like the Soviet version of the B-25, I want to say. And so, no, not B-20, B-52, that's what it is. Soviet version of the B-52, I want to say. And so, now, I explained how they wanted to remove the missile, or the U.S. was going to remove the missiles from Turkey, right? No, they don't. So, the U.S. don't remove their missiles until 1963, actually. The hotline was made after this issue as a direct line between the White House and the Kremlin to conduct nuclear matters, because that was the closest that we have ever been to a nuclear holocaust, was the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so that summer of 63, and there was JFK started coming out with all these great things. So especially equal pay for all workers, regardless of race and gender. He wanted to bring everyone together. He was wanting to kind of bring the civil rights movement into his campaign, or into his presidency, and eliminate all this racial tensions and segregation and everything. And so then sorry, I just lost my train of thought. That fall of 63, after all of these great things that he was doing, he wanted to go on a campaign in Texas, Dallas, Texas at the time. And so, as he's going down the motorcade and everything, he has it's a topless motorcade, because he wanted to be closer to the people. He wanted to actually see the people cheering for him, and he wanted to be amongst the crowd. And so, unfortunately, he's shot. So he's shot right through the head, and he dies right there. Well, he's taken straight to the hospital from there, and then he dies in the hospital. I believe later that evening. Well, he's pronounced dead later on. And so LBJ, Lyndon B. Johnson, he's sworn in on SAM 26000, which was a 707. So that was Air Force One at the time, the 707, and the Boeing 707. And then, so yeah, he's sworn in. Jackie Kennedy is still wearing the bloodstained shirt that was there, that she wore when Kennedy was shot. She's completely shell shocked. She doesn't know what to do. Everything's moving so fast, and LBJ then swears to end the war in Vietnam swiftly and bring about a great society. And so then, by that next year, LBJ pushed for the Great Society. He paid for like programs such as like Medicaid, Medicare starts to develop at around that time. Um, he allowed for citizens of all different levels um, of class, like middle class, upper class, lower class. They can all now obtain health care. The Job Corps, they trained citizens to obtain jobs and focused on urban development and stuff like that. So a lot of cool things are starting to develop from his presidency. Um, the National Organization for Women started around that time too, by Betty Friedan, who in the last lecture I talked about coming out with that book, like just a year prior to this. And so, she also helped protect and fight for equal opportunities for women as well. So that kind of kicked off in 60 or 64. And so the Civil Rights Act was then passed in that same year, 64, and that called for the elimination or prohibition of discrimination. Oh my God, so much pollen out here. For the discrimination in of public areas, and sued states that discriminated women and minorities at that time. And so now, as they're sending liaisons into Vietnam and training these these South Vietnamese troops, and I talked about the Gulf of Tonkin and everything, and so that pretty much that's attack of the USS Maddo, that essentially was now all bets are off. And so now, so US kind of, they kind of went off the deep end a little bit. And so by 65, Rolling Thunder commenced. And this was literally a 2-year aerial bombardment of Vietnam. They wanted to level Vietnam. And so the U.S. naval forces were off the coast. The Air Force conducted operations off of nearby islands, and they prepared for the subsequent invasion of Vietnam later on after that 2-year mark by ground troops. So 66, they started gathering these troops, and by 67, almost 600,000 U.S. soldiers were now in Vietnam. And so the first year, Battle of La Drang, 60, that was back in 65 actually, sorry. So 65, I'm going to go back to my notes here. Yeah, so 65, Rolling Thunder happened. And so, Battle of the Drang, and North Vietnamese then attempted to split the South Vietnamese in half. So, let's see if I can do this here. It's getting windy. There we go. So the U.S. and there's kind of like the line. Oh. So South Vietnamese, kind of like right here. So, Battle of the Drang, the North Vietnamese wanted to split the South Vietnamese in half through the Central Highlands. Now, the U.S. 1st Cavalry Division mobilized to defend this sector. B 52 bombers started taking off from Guam, but essentially, this was the first major North Vietnamese and U.S. battle. Let me write this up here. La Drang. Alright. And so, the U.S. losses were huge. This was the first time they fought entirely in the jungle. This is the first time they fought guerrilla warfare in Vietnam. And so this was an entirely new battle that they're used to. So, First World War, of course, you got column fighting. You got trench fighting. And then it was kind of a mix of old style and newer tactics of fighting. World War II, it was entirely, invasion after invasion, amphibious landings and naval bombardments, all this other stuff. And so, but then when you get to Vietnam, it's almost entirely guerrilla warfare. It's like hit and run tactics essentially. They'll come in, they'll fight you for maybe a couple minutes, then they'll leave, and you'll never see them again, or till later on, essentially. And so, yeah, essentially, that's what happens. And in the first 4 days of this battle, there's about 500 casualties on the U.S. side. The U.S. ended up actually holding off the North Vietnamese, and an estimated about 3,500 of them, according to the U.S., about 3,500 of the North Vietnamese ended up dying in this battle. And so, through through aerial conductions by B-52s and close air support, about the strength of the U.S. air power was emphasized, but also the ground combat extremely weak. And so close quarters combat was a major weakness, as the U.S. couldn't see the enemy as well. And the enemy essentially struck so swiftly and left just as fast as they came. Now, this essentially was what their plan was, to just split them in half. But you got bombers coming in. This is a really crappy bomber. And then you also got ground troops coming in to reinforce. Alright. Now, I know good and well this is not how the battle went, but this is a very simple idea of it. Alright, so you got U.S. and South Vietnamese forces holding the line for the North Vietnamese invasion. And so the North Vietnamese wanted to split the U.S. and South Vietnamese forces in half, but then you got close air support coming in from the or off the coast to conduct close air support and strategic bombing operations on the North Vietnamese. And now, so that's going on in Vietnam and everything, Vietnam. But back home, we got a couple things. Winston Churchill, he's the last one. So Stalin actually died soon after the war, essentially, I believe. No, he died in, I think, 50s, I want to say. He died, I believe, of hypertension. And so Winston Churchill ends up dying. He's the last one out of FDR and Stalin to die, out of the big three, essentially. So he's the last one to die, and essentially that ends an era of basically the World War II leaders. And at this time as well, You also got a bunch of civil rights uprisings. So I'm kind of jumping back and forth because there's so much stuff that goes on between the U.S. because of the Red Scare. You got civil rights, and you also got the Vietnam War, all happening in like a span of this whole entire decade. And so the 60s, you got the Greensboro sit-in, 1960 essentially, which was a bunch of diner counters. Diner counters at the time were segregated, so you had a whole bunch of people who would sit in and take control of these diners. They would be abused, beaten. Battery was taking place everywhere, and so it was hella violent. But they did it, and so whites assaulted these participants constantly. 1961, you had the Freedom Rides. So these were segregated freeways that were prompted for violence on the road, essentially. And so you had, these people who would take over, or not take over, but they would end up riding unsegregated on these highways or freeways. And then people would see them, pull them over, burn the cars, or pull them out and beat them, stuff like that. 1963, you got the March on Washington by MLK, who says the famous "I Have a Dream" speech. This speech, or this march, was to advocate for African American rights in general, essentially. He says, like, I have a dream that children will be judged not by their skin, but by the content of their characters, like that. That same year, I think, no, 2 years later, actually. So in Selma, Alabama, those marches. So those were to protest black rights to vote, and so to gain those rights. It was a 54-mile march. It was met by extreme violence from authorities and white, like, supremacist groups. And then that same year, the Voting Rights Act finally came out, which eliminated literacy requirements and poll taxes, so it made it easier for African Americans of a lower class to actually go in and start and vote, essentially. Now, blacks then as well began to take on a more military role, essentially. Now, because of this is where we get the rise of the Black Panthers, Malcolm X, essentially, and this idea that violence is the only way to change their opinion of us. And so now you got this huge discrepancy between do purple this time. So I'm feeling like a little purple. So you got MLK, MX. Let's see. Action. So there's a lot more to it, but essentially just remember these two things. So you got Malcolm X, who is all about making sure you protect yourself, defend yourself against these white supremacists, because what they're doing to you is not right. So why can't you do whatever they're doing to you, do it back to them? Make them know that you're not to be abused, you're not to be messed with. So MLK, on the other hand, is like, peace. Do not stoop down to their level. You're better than that. MLK was all about diplomacy. Fight the higher ups, because they're the ones that are going to change the people down below. Malcolm X, on the other hand, he's like, take action now. Take action on the people who are wronging you. And so you get this giant discrepancy between the two. And now, neither of them are either wrong nor right. And so, yeah, sure, action may actually change things swiftly, but also diplomacy is the correct way, legal way to do things. Violence will gather a lot of notoriety, a lot of public outrage, and maybe drive this movement, the civil rights movement, but also peace assures that you are not, your life is not in jeopardy. And so, Malcolm X ends up actually being assassinated later on in '65 as well. And so now we get to, oh, of course, in MLK as well is assassinated as well. Sorry. And so, and then, oh, and Robert Kennedy is also assassinated. Yeah, man, a lot. So I think April 8th was when he ended up being assassinated. April 8th of 19 January, March, April. Yeah, April 8th of 1968, MLK ends up being assassinated. And so yeah, see 7. So 67 Vietnam War is at its height essentially. And then you got the Summer of Love. So because of this Vietnam War, you got a lot of journalists who are going out there and actually documenting the war. Now, because they're documenting the war, where are they going to? They're going back to the U.S. and they're spreading all that information. So now everything that happens in the Vietnam War is not a secret anymore. People, so you got politicians, officials who are going onto the media and saying, no, we're winning the war, we're doing just fine, we're not taking as many casualties as the enemy. We're taking control of all this land. We're pushing forward. We're pushing them back. Well, that's not the case according to all the journalists. So the journalists come back and they're like, no, we're actually dying left and right. We have hundreds of people dying weeks and upon weeks at a time. We don't know where the enemy is. We're losing land as much as we're gaining land. We're not making any headway. And so there's a lot of public outrage about this because essentially, yeah, sure, we got into the Vietnam War, but what's in it for us? Like, why are we there? That is more of an issue for them, for the South Vietnamese and the North Vietnamese to hash out on their own. We don't want to sacrifice our fathers, our sons, for a cause that there is nothing in it. Nothing in it for us? So why are we over there? And so we're not there to control. I mean, sure, yeah, we're there to help, but why not just help? Why do we have to actually put our men on the front lines for them? So that's kind of like that idea that the people had at that time. So the Summer of Love kind of kicks off. It's a widespread hippie movement involvement. Everybody, love, make peace, not war. Make love, not war, that kind of thing. So 67 that kicks off, and 68 was a Tet Offensive. So a year after this Summer of Love kicks off, you got the oh shoot, my dad. Now he can. I'll let him know later on. And so the Tet Offensive during the South Vietnam New Year. And so a large-scale surprise attack happens by the North Vietnamese. And so all South Vietnamese cities were targeted, and installations, everything. And so now LBJ at that time said that the U.S. was winning the war. Well, then now you get Saigon and the U.S. Embassy were attacked and taken over by the North Vietnamese. You got the Battle of Hue. Battle of Hue, where it was attack for more so a political importance. It was the capital of Indochina at the time, and so it was for 25 days. The U.S. forces encountered an attack, after attack by the North Vietnamese. Ultimately, they held out, and the North Vietnamese ended up retreating at that time. So, and then they ended up actually executing about 3,000 Soviet civilians at the time. And so that was the longest and bloodiest battle of the war. Essentially, it was the Tet Offensive, and so this destroyed public morale. And at the time, it was the fact that at the same time that LBJ said that the U.S. was winning the war, you then get this widespread attack, and then the fall of Saigon, essentially, and protests were widespread now back in the U.S. We were pissed. And so the hippie involvement kickstarted as protests against the Vietnam War was widespread. People believed the war was unwinnable and that we should just pull out right now. In total, there was like 2,000 U.S. casualties at the Tet Offensive, along with another 4,000 South Vietnamese casualties. And then on top of that, 13,000 civilians ended up dying in total after all that. And so, um, after MLK and Robert Kennedy were both shot and killed within that same year, 68, this was just total widespread animosity. Increased separation and animosity amongst political parties, amongst social parties. And so, 69, Nixon becomes president. And he promises to end the war honorably and end the bloodshed and just make peace and everything. So that's 1969 in January. And August of 1969, you got, of course, what was it? You got August 1969. Is that Woodstock, I want to say? And so it was like 400,000 people all gathered around at Woodstock. And then you got Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, Grateful Dead, Jefferson Airplane, Creedence Clearwater, Revival, places, people like that. And so this essentially brought the world together. And it was a short period of time where you had no one was at war with each other at home, essentially. And the civil rights, essentially, it took a push forward towards the community, like towards community activism and pro women and pro black movements. You got more representation in businesses, employment, education, etc. So the like Freedom Bank opened and stuff like that, and so it was amazing. Amazing stuff happened. So essentially, that's kind of what happened throughout that whole time period. And there was just non-stop differences in opinion, back and forth. And so by 72, which was the first black-owned bank, ended up opening by Earl Graves at the time. So Earl Graves created the Black Enterprise magazine, essentially. The first black-owned bank was opened in that same year. Robert L. Johnson and Sheila Johnson created BET in 79. Al Johnson started the black-owned auto dealerships in that time as well. So there's a lot of stuff. But now, things came to a head, though. May 4th of 1970, you got the Kent State demonstration on the Vietnam War. This was after Nixon said that he'll invade Cambodia. So this dude said that he's going to end the war. And then, not even a year later, says that he's invading Cambodia. So students were also now mad. So these students, they go out and they're just like, you know what, we have to do something to make him stop. And so the National Guard ends up coming to put down this uprising, this peaceful protest, and they, I think, I don't know what, I think someone like threw, no, so I guess apparently something had happened, and hey, pretty good yourself?
Good.
Well, that's good. Hey, yeah, it's a nice day out.
Unfortunately, it's not going to stay that way.
I know. I heard like later tonight. It's supposed
tonight,
to be,
yeah, it's supposed to start raining tonight.
Yeah.
Tomorrow's supposed to be chilly, but it's supposed to get warmer, I guess, next week.
Yeah.
Monday. Of course,
right. Monday. Right. Essentially, yeah, because
Exactly.
I think I work as 24 on Monday actually.
Yeah. Right.
Monday. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Hello, kitty.
Yeah, like my cat loves dogs.
Does it?
Yeah, because I got him from my friend who has a dog, and they were like, well, he loved the dog did not like him.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, so he always wanted to play with
everybody.
him. That's good.
She's trying to find this rabbit that hopping around. She's like,
yeah, I saw the rabbit hopping around last night too.
Yeah.
She's trying to find him.
Absolutely crazy. She's like, hey, rabbit. I say, hey, what's that? What's that? It's a kitty cat. Say hello. Oh, that kitty cat saying hi. Yeah, saying hi. All right, girl, we gotta get going. You have a good day.
Thanks, you too. Yep, see ya.
All right, little lady.
Oh, but yeah, so the Kent State demonstration, um, so that happened, and then they were, all, so the National Guard held him at gunpoint, and something had happened, and I believe like a rock was thrown or something, and one of the soldiers opened fire. So then everyone, it was just kind of a chain reaction, and just gunshots started happening everywhere, and about 4 people ended up dying, and another 9 were injured. So then at this point, guess who lost trust? The people, and who? The government. So now trust in the government was lost amongst the people, increased animosity towards the Vietnam War, increased student activism. The US was just imploding at this time. 71 comes along, and Nikita Khrushchev ends up dying of a heart attack. Um, Mikhail Gorbachev now becomes prime minister, and then Nixon ended the conflict in Vietnam and increased positive relations with China and signed the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. Essentially, by 72, he starts wanting to just pull people out. Um, so by doing so, he ends up kind of like he limited nuclear power or nuclear arms between the Soviets and the U.S., and he feels that there was added pressure from the re-election and needed a way to kind of secure the presidency. Um, so a way to retaliate against his opponents and find out secret info about them, he wiretapped the Oval Office. So then this culminates in the Watergate incident. So I'm gonna hold off there and pick up next time with that. And so now we're at 1972. So this is kind of where distrust in the government comes along. All these what do you call that? All these kind of um, what do you call that? Conspiracy theories come along, political assassination, the CIA coming into the mix, and so I will hold off there in Vietnam essentially. So Vietnam doesn't end till actually more so like 75, but um, by 72 this kind of like starts ramping down. That's when the issue of Vietnam wants is to pull them out now at that point, and so I'm gonna hold off there and then pick up next time with 1972 and continue on. And so, um, so yeah, so I'm just gonna stop there, and then it's a pretty nice day out, and so I believe today I will have time to go over some midterms and grade those now, and then um, kind of continue on Sunday with them as well, and then after that it'll be 1970, 1980, and 1980 to 1990, and that'll be the end. So we're on the final stretch, and then we'll be your midterm actually coming up in April as well, or your final coming up in April. So essentially it's going to be kind of the same thing as the midterm. Actually, no, it's going to be a little bit different. It's going to be pretty much more open-ended. Um, but hopefully you guys enjoy the final and everything. And then later tonight I'll try to do another lecture again on what was it on the U.S. and the Holocaust. Essentially because I got clearance now to do that, and so I'll do that real quick. And so besides that, I'm gonna start cleaning some more and try to enjoy the sun a little bit before it starts raining later on tonight. Hopefully it doesn't rain. Hopefully it stays like this. It's pretty good out. So, but yeah, no. Say bye to good old Oscar. So then I'm gonna catch you guys on the flip side, and then I'm gonna just enjoy my day for a little bit before I have to go back to studying again. All right, y'all take care now. All right.